From Colony to Nation in Spanish America and Brazil, Part 2. These two maps show Spanish and Portuguese America prior to and after independence. The first map showing the administrative units of the Portuguese and Spanish empires. The second map of 1830 showing the region divided into nation states, independent nation states. The purpose of today's lecture is to explain how this transition happened by examining the processes of independence in three different regions: Mexico and Central America, Northern South America, and the southern part of South America. During the last lecture, we had seen that these were some of the factors leading to independence. The first was that Creoles, or people of European descent who had been born in the Americas and were part of the elite, as well as other social classes, were discontent with excessive taxation. They were also discontent with the lack of free trade within the Spanish Empire and with the loss of privileges as a result of the Bourbon reforms. We also saw that the impact of the Enlightenment was strong in Latin America, with new ideas of popular sovereignty circulating throughout the region. Finally, we saw that the Spanish monarchy had been weakened by Napoleon's invasion of Spain and Portugal, and that in the case of Spain, the Spanish people wrote a constitution for the year 1812. This constitution created a new constitutional framework in Spanish America. It established individual freedoms, such as the freedom of the press. It created the first elections in Spanish America, where people voted for delegates to the Constitutional Convention. And the voters included indigenous people, mestizos, and blacks. I will note, therefore, that by contrast to the United States, you have people of mixed race voting as early as 1809 and 1810 in Spanish America as part of elections for a constitutional convention. Now, once the Constitutional Convention came into place and the process of writing this constitution began in Spain, the delegates that were sent from the Americas, Creole delegates sent for the Americas, found that they were receiving second-class treatment. They had come to Spain with the expectation that they would be able to assert certain rights in the face of this new situation of a constitutional monarchy. And however, they were very frustrated once they arrived in Spain to realize that they did not have the power to assert these rights. One of the readings that you will be doing for this week is by Juan Pablo Vizcardo y Guzmán, who was a Creole and a Jesuit who had been expelled from Peru in the year 1767. One of the things that you will note in his reading, in the reading of his letter, is the fact that he talks about rights. He frames his discussion in terms of rights. And what we see here is a direct influence of the ideas of the Enlightenment, the notion that the people of Spanish America had certain rights that they could assert in the face of the Spanish monarchy. This was a new idea because under the old Spanish colonial system, the Spanish monarchy did not recognize any sort of individual rights. The people of the Americas were simply subjects of Spain. What you'll see that Vizcardo y Guzmán is proposing when he talks about Americans, and keep in mind that when he talks about Americans, he's not talking about the US, but rather he's talking about Spanish America more generally. When he's asserting these rights of Americans, what he's doing is saying we are no longer subjects, we are now on our way to be citizens And what we need to do is to break from Spain in order to assert these rights. So pay attention to his language, because it's language that connects what's going on to this broader process of the Enlightenment and to notion of individual rights that began to be current throughout Europe, North America, and South America. Before we look at the revolutionary wars in Latin America, we need to make a distinction between two different types of revolution: political revolution and social revolution. A political revolution involves a change of rulers. In the case of the US and the American Revolution, we find that this is a good example of a political revolution where the colonies were no longer ruled by England, but now came to rule themselves. A change, therefore, in the rulers. A social revolution is a much deeper process in which the social structures of society are changed. There isn't just a change of rulers, but there's a change in the way society is organized and in the class that holds political power. Often what happens in a social revolution is that a class that had been on the bottom of society is now able to overthrow its rulers and to therefore change the social structure. Some modern day examples of such social revolutions are the Russian Revolution, or the Chinese Revolution, the Cuban Revolution. This leads then to the question of which class led the revolutionary wars. Let's keep this as an open question, and we'll return to it at the end of the lecture so that we have a clear idea of what type of revolutions were the ones that occurred in Spanish America: political or social revolutions. Now, the very first revolution to occur in the region, and this was the second revolution after that of the United States, occurred in the French colony of Haiti. This was a slave insurrection that began in 1791 and lasted for 13 years, going all the way to 1804, when finally Haiti declared its independence as an independent republic from Spain. And what was very unusual about this revolution is that it began as a slave insurrection, and it completely inverted the social order, overthrowing the French colonial powers and putting what had been former slaves and black people in Haiti in charge. What type of revolution was this? Yes, you're correct. This was a social revolution because it inverted the social order. One of the things that you have to keep in mind as we study this period is the interconnection between these various different places. This was already a globalized world where information from one place flowed to another. Of course, not as smoothly or quickly as it does today when we have the internet. Nonetheless, there were newspapers, there was word of mouth and publications got around. What did people in Spanish America, and particularly elites, think about the Haitian Revolution? Yes, you guessed it, they were afraid. Keep in mind that they were living in a society where they were a minority, with mestizos, Indians, blacks, as part of this society underneath them, and there was a great deal of fear following the Haitian Revolution that something similar could happen in Spanish and Portuguese America, and there could be an uprising by the lower classes who would take over power. Therefore, the Haitian Revolution served as a sort of warning to the elites, both Spanish and Creole, in the region of what they didn't want to occur. We had seen in the prior lecture that one of the impacts of the constitutional crisis, the political crisis in Spain resulting from Napoleon's invasion, was the creation of juntas, or city councils, throughout the Spanish Empire, city councils which now took on extra powers in the absence of the monarchy. And once these events began to unfold, some of these councils, or juntas, began to question the monarchy and to declare for independence. These juntas were made up of Creoles and Spaniards, and depending on the balance of power with them, they were more in favor of the Spanish monarchy or more in favor of independence. One of the first juntas to declare independence, to sever the ties with Spain, was the one in Buenos Aires, what is today Argentina. Buenos Aires was a region that had been for a long time on the outskirts of the empire with very little population. However, by the early 1800s, it had become an important trading post. And many of the people, and Creoles in particular in this region, were very much in favor of free trade, something that was limited under the Spanish Empire. There was therefore the desire to break ties because of this issue of free trade. Another important point to keep in mind about Buenos Aires is that the confidence of the people of Buenos Aires had already increased as a result of an incursion that occurred in 1806 when the British, taking advantage of the weakness of Spain at the time, attacked Buenos Aires with the expectations that they might be able to annex this region into the British Empire. The people of Buenos Aires were able to repel the attack of the British on their own. What this did is it gave them a great deal of self-confidence, and it also made them realize that they could defend themselves and that they really didn't need Spain to defend them. So these two factors, the fact that the people of Buenos Aires realized that they could defend themselves, and the fact that they were very much in favor of having a free trade that didn't exist within the confines of the Spanish Empire, created a very specific set of circumstances and discontent in this region that then blew up once the Spanish monarchy was weakened by the Napoleonic invasion. And this junta in 1810, as I mentioned, was one of the first to declare independence. It's at this point that the figure of José de San Martín, who is considered the main figure and leader of the independence efforts in South America, emerged. San Martín was a Creole and an officer in the Spanish armies who had been fighting against Napoleon. However, when he heard that his city had declared independence, he returned from Spain and he joined the efforts here, the efforts to secure independence. And this was the insight that José de San Martín had about the process. He realized that the independence of Spanish America and specifically of Buenos Aires was not safe until the Spanish forces were defeated in the much more powerful and royalist region of Peru, and specifically the city of Lima. With this concern in mind, he began to organize an army that would march across the Andes from what is today Argentina into Chile, where he fought a series of battles and was able to declare Chilean independence, and then biding his time in Chile in order to gain support from the Chilean people, as well as raising money for ships to then sail north to Peru, he eventually arrived in Peru and was able to declare Peruvian independence in 1821. One of the feats of San Martín, here you have a map that shows if you look at the purple arrows at the bottom, how San Martín marched into Chile where he had the help of a man named O'Higgins, who was elected head of Chile. And then he went on to Lima, where he declared independence in 1821. One of his feats was to march an army of 5,000 people across the Andes in order to launch this surprise attack on Chile. If we go back to the map, you can see that you have the Andes, the high mountains of the Andes separating Argentina and Chile, and nobody expected, because this had never been done, that an army would be brought across the high mountain passes of the Andes to attack Chile. The royalists in Chile had expected that army to come through the south, and it was this element of surprise that also helped San Martín. This is an image that you see of the army, of him taking his army through the high passes. We're talking about a region that is as high as 15 or 16,000 feet, where people get altitude sickness known as soroche. And one of the things that you'll notice about this picture is that it actually doesn't depict the army as realistically as it should, because in fact, 1/3 of this army of 5,000 was made up of African slaves who are, as often happens in history, written out of the picture, not included in the picture. And these African slaves were promised their freedom in exchange for fighting in these armies of liberation. At the same time as San Martín was launching this titanic effort in the southern part of South America, another man whose name was Simón Bolívar became the central figure in the process of independence in northern South America. As in the case of Buenos Aires, Caracas, in what is modern-day Venezuela, was also early. The junta in Caracas was one of the early juntas that declared independence from Spain. This occurred in the year 1810. Simón Bolívar was a native and a Creole of Caracas, of Venezuela. You see a portrait of him here. Even though he was a Creole, he also had African ancestry, as many people did in this region that had received a large proportion of African population as a result of the slave trade. So strictly speaking, he was of mixed race, and this speaks to the complexities of the social scene and of society in Spanish America. The fact that you had people of mixed race who were actually able to still remain part of the elite. This is a topic we'll return to a little bit later as we talk about society in the 19th century. Bolívar was a very privileged man, somebody who received an education, was sent by his parents to Europe, actually with a tutor, to study in Europe, and he became imbued in the ideas of the Enlightenment and almost obsessed with the idea that Latin America needed to break with the monarchy and become part of a republic. He therefore, just like San Martín, also returned to his native lands when this process of independence began to break out, and quickly rose to a position of leadership as a general in the armies. In 1815, he had gone into exile in Jamaica, and the Jamaica letter that you're reading this week was a letter that he wrote seeking support from the British for the process of independence in Spanish America. And in this letter, he also gives his vision of why he thinks Spanish America should turn to a republican form of government. And he also lays out his ideas about the importance of a unified Spanish America. He wanted the countries not to be fragmented into various different countries, as we saw in the map at the beginning of the lecture, but rather he wanted to have a united Spanish America, something that did not happen. So Bolívar's vision did not come to pass for a number of different reasons. When he wrote this letter, there was a hiatus in his struggle for independence because there had been a lot of defeats, and the royalists at this point had the upper hand in the region of Nueva Granada or New Granada, which was what is today modern-day Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador. However, after writing the letter, he was able to return to the continent to reorganize his armies, eventually to fight in a number of battles where the royalists were defeated, also moving troops through the Andes, although the Andes are not as high up in the north as they are in the south where San Martin was. And eventually, he was able to defeat the Spaniards, to form a congress in the city of Angostura in the year 1819, which declared a new republic, the Republic of Gran Colombia, or Great Colombia, which included the modern-day countries of Ecuador, Venezuela, and Colombia. And Simón Bolívar was elected as the president of this republic. He then went on and met with San Martin in the city of Guayaquil in Ecuador in the year 1822. These were the two great generals, with the Northern Army led by Bolívar, the Southern Army led by San Martin. And at this very secretive meeting, which nobody knows the content of, there's no documentation as to what happened. All we know is that the ultimate result was that San Martin bowed out, went into exile in England, and basically handed his armies over to Bolívar, who then concluded the process of fighting for independence by marching both of these armies into Peru, where he fought the last battle of the Wars of Independence, a very famous battle called the Battle of Ayacucho. Ayacucho is a place in the central Andes, to which the royalist forces had retreated in the hopes of being able to then receive reinforcements. So this was a battle that was fought up in the high Andes with men from various different countries, from Colombia, Chile, Argentina, as well as some mercenaries that had joined from various different parts of Europe, as well as the local indigenous populations. And it was this battle, the Battle of Ayacucho, that sealed the independence of Spanish South America. Bolívar is a larger-than-life figure who was both a general, and this is an image of the Battle of Boyacá, which was the battle that eventually led to guaranteeing the independence of Gran Colombia. In this battle picture, you do see the depiction of African people, and Bolívar also recruited slaves who were promised their freedom into his armies. So Bolívar was both a masterful general, but he was also a political thinker. And this is a constitution that he wrote for the Republic of Bolivia, which, yes, you guessed it, is named after Bolívar. We need to think then of Bolívar as a kind of a combination of both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, as a great general, but also as a great political thinker who had very specific ideas about the importance of creating republics as opposed to monarchies in Spanish America. He also, however, as we will see, was a realist and was also very preoccupied about what the fate of republics would be, because he wasn't sure that the people of Latin America were ready to rule themselves. They had been under monarchy, they had not ruled themselves for 300 years, And even though he believed that republics were the way to go, he wasn't sure about how stable these republics would be. And as a result of that, he created some instruments that we see in this constitution. When I say instruments, I mean political instruments, to strengthen these republics by making them very, very centralized, by having a very strong executive. By the way, this particular constitution was not implemented in Bolivia, but it does show us this other side of Bolivar, this important side of Bolivar as a political thinker. In summary, then, the processes of political independence were led by Creoles. What kind of revolutions were these? These were political revolutions. Although you had people of the lower classes participating in the armies, there was no questioning of the existing political order in the case of this process of independence. You have the replacement of the Spanish monarchy now by a Creole elite, but the social structure of these societies remained pretty much the same. Let's turn now to the process of independence in Mexico, where events would take an unexpected and rather different turn from those in Spanish South America. The figure most remembered as a kind of founding father in Mexico for launching the process of independence was a Creole priest named Miguel Hidalgo. He was the priest of a small rural parish called Dolores. And here, in this rural area, he had become part of a group of Creoles who would meet frequently because they were discontent with Spanish rule. These Creoles began to hatch a plot to overthrow not the monarchy, but rather the colonial administrators in Mexico City. These Creoles sought to break away from some of the restrictions that were placed by Spain and to create improvements in their own lives in the colonies, including economic reforms that would improve the lives of people throughout the colonial setting in Mexico. Now, this plot was discovered, and as a result of this, Miguel Hidalgo used his pulpit, you could call literally a bully pulpit. He used his position and his pulpit in this rural parish of Dolores to go out and call upon his parishioners, who were primarily mestizos and Indians, to rise up against the colonial authorities. And it is this call that occurred on the 16th of September from his church that is now celebrated as Mexican independence. You see here a depiction of Hidalgo by the very famous muralist José Clemente Orozco. This is a later depiction in the 20th century of Miguel Hidalgo and what is now known as the Grito de Dolores, or the Cry of Dolores. This Grito de Dolores is also celebrated as Mexican Independence Day every year. The image on the right is of Mexico City and the Zócalo, or the main square, where the president comes out every year on the 16th of September to reenact this cry for independence. It is most likely, we don't exactly know what Hidalgo said that day, but it is most likely that he wasn't actually calling for independence from Spain and from the monarchy, but rather just rising up against what were seen as unjust authorities. What happened next went beyond what the Creole priest had expected. He unleashed the anger of Indians and mestizos throughout the countryside who had been facing loss of land, unemployment, lack of food, and furthermore, a drought that was seriously affecting their livelihood. And this led to the beginnings of a revolt where Hidalgo and his indigenous and mestizo troops now marched through the countryside. He often lost control of these troops and they destroyed property, the property of haciendas or large estates. As a result of this, leading Creole and Spanish elites to become scared because here was a social revolution in the making. These were the lower classes of society rising up and challenging the power of the elite. In this map, you can see the trajectory of this revolt as it marched through the countryside. Hidalgo at one point tried and was going to take over, but did not take Mexico City. This was too difficult an endeavor. And eventually, the revolt begins to dwindle. Keep in mind that this was not a regular professional army. These were people who were farmers and eventually had to return to their farms and couldn't sustain a revolt for very, very long. And eventually what happened is that Hidalgo was captured in the year 1811. And as happened with people who rose up against the monarchy, he was executed. Before his execution, he was held in a convent that was on the site of this government building shown here in the state of Chihuahua. And you can visit it, and there's a museum that shows the cell where Hidalgo was held before his execution. So not far from here. Chihuahua City is only about 4 hours south. After his execution, the Mexican independence movement would drag on for another 10 years. It continued under the leadership of another priest, José María Morelos, and José María Morelos was a mestizo who now led the remaining troops, took them into the mountains of southern Mexico, and here he called the Congress of Chilpancingo, in the year 1813. I'm going to show you this on the map. You can see Chilpancingo there in the southern part of Mexico. And it was at this point that these rebels actually called for Mexican independence and had delegates at this Congress who now began to envision an independent Mexico. However, Morelos met the same fate as Hidalgo. He was eventually caught and executed by the royalist forces. And the movement now fell into the hands of a man named Vicente Guerrero, who was a mulatto. He was of African descent. And interestingly, after Mexican independence in 1828, he would be elected to be president of Mexico. A reminder that Mexico had its first black president in the year 1828, almost 2 centuries before the United States. Vicente Guerrero was able to hide out in the mountains of the Sierra Madre del Sur, where he and the rebels were able to evade the royalist forces because they engaged in guerrilla warfare. The man who was sent to combat these forces was a Creole, and keep in mind that I'm very deliberately telling you what the social background is of these various different individuals, because I think that it helps us to understand what their interests were and who ultimately was in the leadership of this movement, because you have the mulatto, Vicente Guerrero, on the one hand, rebelling, fighting for independence, and then Agustín de Iturbide, a Creole who was sent by the viceroy in Mexico City to squash the forces of Vicente Guerrero. What eventually happened, and I'm going to make a long story short, you can read about the details of this in the textbook, was that Iturbide eventually decided that he too would rebel against Spain, and in the process of persecuting Guerrero, he turned sides, met with Guerrero, and together they came to an agreement that's known as the Plan de Iguala for the town where it was signed. And this Plan de Iguala, signed in 1821, was in fact the official declaration of Mexican independence. So what began with Hidalgo as a social revolution ends up in the hands of a Creole, Agustín de Iturbide, who leads independence, and ends up as a very conservative declaration of independence, one that did not try to overthrow the social institutions, that recognized the power of the church, that claimed that it would no longer persecute Spaniards in Mexico, but that nonetheless declared Mexico as an independent state. And the conservatism in the case of Mexico was further reinforced when the following year, in 1822, Agustín de Iturbide declared himself Emperor of Mexico. He didn't last as emperor for very long. He only lasted from 1822 to 1823. However, there was this initial attempt that contrasts with what we've seen in Spanish America, where Bolívar emphasized republicanism, where Mexico began as an empire, as a monarchy. However, this quickly ended, and Mexico soon, in 1823, became a republic. One of the reasons that Iturbide was not able to sustain a monarchy was because he was not himself a monarch. He was simply a Creole general, and to put it simply, nobody really believed in him as king. You can't just stand up and say you're king. Monarchy is part of a traditional system that is much more complex in order for it to have legitimacy. By contrast, Brazil was able to begin its independence life as a monarchy. Brazilian independence was declared in 1822 by the son of the Portuguese monarch. The Portuguese monarch's name was João VI, or John VI, and his son Pedro, who is depicted here, declared independence in 1822 and became Pedro I of Brazil. So by contrast to the rest of Spanish America, Brazil takes a very different path, and its independence was much more bloodless and less violent than that of Spanish America. Some of the factors leading up to this have also to do with Napoleon and with the reaction of the Portuguese monarchy faced with Napoleon's invasion, because by contrast to the Spanish king Ferdinand VII, who was put in jail, weakening the Spanish monarchy, the Portuguese king João VI was able to flee with his entire court to Rio de Janeiro when Napoleon invaded the Iberian Peninsula in the year 1807. Here he set up his court, and in 1815 Brazil was declared a kingdom equal to Portugal. Brazil is therefore strengthened as a former colony and now the seat of the Portuguese monarchy. This is the only case in the Americas of the capital of a European monarchy being established in the Americas. Now, eventually, João had to return to Portugal. He left his son, Pedro, in charge. And as I just mentioned, it was Pedro who declared Brazilian independence and had the legitimacy, because he was the son of a monarch, to declare himself king and for people to believe that he was in fact king because he belonged to the royal family. The Bragança family was the name of the Portuguese royal family. We thus see that in the case of Brazil, and here I'm ending just with a picture that shows the Portuguese monarch fleeing from Lisbon as Napoleon's troops were closing in. He boards, he and his court, it was a very spectacular sort of process where he and his court boarded a series of ships that were waiting for them, and they were helped by the British and by the British Navy to transport the whole court to Brazil. And once again, in the case of Brazil, what we get with independence is a political revolution, simply a change in the leadership of Brazil, no longer ruled by Portugal, but now ruled by a group of Brazilians and a king who, although Portuguese by descent, was now ruling an independent Brazil. I'd like you to keep in mind then these contrasts between the various different paths followed by Spanish South America, Mexico, and Brazil, and also to remember the importance of Haiti, which was really the only true social revolution that occurred in the Americas, with slaves taking over, and the impact that this had on elites that were ruling over societies where they, in fact, where the whites, where the Europeans were, in fact, a minority.